So many of you are diligent to read ahead, even to look into commentary literature on the coming verses for our messages and pursuit of the integrity and understanding of authorial purpose in the book of Acts. We've reached the penultimate chapter, chapter 27. And I have to tell you that many commentators, if not perplexed, are in puzzlement over the length that Luke devotes to this, what some have called, with a bit of trite alliteration, this section has often been called sea voyage, shipwreck, and snakebite. I'm not entirely going to sign off on that, but only to let you know that these three events will take place in the coming weeks as well as this morning, and that what we'd like to do is broaden our knowledge of what actually takes place and draw more than simply an adventure from the high seas, but lessons for life. And certainly the sea voyage, the shipwreck, and the snakebite do indicate that as with Paul, so with us, God protects us. And this is certainly what Luke shows to the conclusion of the book, that as God has revealed to Paul he will see Rome, despite wreck at sea and snakebite on land, Paul does arrive sound in body and mind and walk with brothers into the city of Rome. But let's go to the high seas. Talk about the nautical images. Talk about the maritime archaeology that has brought a great knowledge to us about ancient seafaring, and see if we can't divine some things that may help us in life. So I say lastly, before reading the first 12 verses, that often in the history of interpretation, chapter 27, again the penultimate chapter of the entire 2-volume set of Luke Acts, that in this, often individuals have found it to be best interpreted allegorically. That is to say, that it is taken up in the mind of the interpreter that what Paul is doing in the section we are about to read is an allegory of the soul's travel through life, so that a tempestuous, difficult voyage is the voyage a Christian must make in this life, but God protects. Well, there are certainly some illustrations like that, but we are going to eschew the allegorical method. There's so much rich history and detail here that the puzzlement of interpreters we've talked about may be solved by a careful look at culture, history, and maritime travel in the ancient world. Let's read it. Acts chapter 27, verses 1 through 12, although I will insinuate something from verse 13. Interesting. The word of the Lord. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon. Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea, sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, Since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty, sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. When considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest, northwest, and spend the winter there. May God add his divine supernal blessing to the reading of his sacred word. Well, I mentioned maritime or nautical archaeology. This is the practice of the last half century that has become somewhat of a sophisticated pursuit. Because of modern technology, archaeologists have been able to go into the clear waters of the Mediterranean and note, study, and even exhume ancient sailing vessels from the first century and earlier. It's become what I certainly think is a fascinating pursuit of the culture and practices of the early church. Because in the ancient world, travel by boat was for them what airline travel is for us. And so there are large planes which take us intercontinentally or internationally, transatlantic, to the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Large, what as kids we used to call jumbo jets. Our parents would take us to the airport and show us those large ships, and we were airships, and we were in awe of them. But there were also commuter ships. For example, if you fly from here to Chattanooga, you may take a larger plane, but then if you're commuting to a small Kentucky or Tennessee town, you'll take a commuter plane, smaller, and I might add at times a little bit difficult. We become seasick in the air on some of those commuter flights. But all that aside, the analogy is that in the ancient world, seaports and maritime travel was the majoritarian way to take passage to another part of the world. Although our early studies of the first two tours of Paul in missionary work, he traveled by the Egnatian Way, the Roman roads, which proliferated across the empire, transporting, yes, armies, but also commerce and goods. But the main way of travel and commerce was the ship. So that should register with us, and each of the two ships we're going to discuss this morning, both were cargo ships, which leads to an interesting observation that I think escapes most readers of Acts 27, and that is this. In the first century, there were no passenger ships. Now, today, we have tours on ships. We are familiar with passenger ships, ocean liners, even back to the ill-fated Titanic, where individuals are listening to an opera while the ship plies the waters of the Atlantic. So we think as moderns, when we read chapter 27, we're thinking, well, they got on board, paid for a ticket, and got on board a passenger ship. Well, there were no passenger ships. So what would take place was individuals would go to the port at which the ship, either a small coasting vessel or a larger transport vessel, and they would pay a fee to embark on the voyage, but they had to provide their own food, they had to provide their own sleeping arrangements. For example, oftentimes wealthy passengers on these cargo and transport ships would bring their slaves with them, and they would have a tent literally set up on the deck at night to sleep in. So all the voyages about which you read in the book of Acts are not passenger ships, they're cargo ships carrying commercial goods and having regular, if you will, flights from port to port. A very common feature of the ancient world. We'll talk about it later, but you remember Paul's ministry in the Aegean, to the east in Corinth and Achaia, to the west, Asia Minor in Turkey. So across that Aegean, Paul had traveled many times. And in his second missionary trip, when a man appears in a vision and says, "Come over and help us," he has to go from Troas on the eastern side of the Aegean to Neapolis, which is the seaport for Thessalonica. We have a Thessalonican brother we'll talk about in just a few moments. So sea passage, however, was more than a way of transport. It was an idiom of literature that was unique in the ancient world. By that I mean that they, the Greco-Romans, prized highly accounts of sea voyages, mythical and real, and also shipwrecks. Now, you know this already, you just don't realize you know it. And the reason you know it is that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey had almost a religious aspect in Greco-Roman culture. And what do we find in the Odyssey? Spellbinding stories of sea voyage and shipwreck that entranced the reading audience. So that Homer, again, nearly of a venerated as a religious part of the culture, started the idiom or the genre or the type of literature in which sea voyages became extremely popular, not only in Homer and in myth, but in novels of the early world. Not only that, but the Romans especially had an interesting relationship with seafaring boats in their warfare. You're aware, I know, of the Punic Wars, first, second, and some call for a third, in the middle of the 3rd century BC. This pitted, if we could say that, the Carthaginians of North Africa to the Romans of the peninsula of Italy. The Romans found out quite quickly that when it came to sea travel, they held no cards. The Carthaginians were a seafaring, like the Phoenicians. The Carthaginians were seafaring, and Carthage a large seaport. So Rome, ultimately, I think to their embarrassment, thought, well, we'll just build fleets. So, in the middle of the 3rd century BC, an experimentation was made, and Rome built over 100 warships. Well, especially important for us is the historical and cultural fact that those 100 ships, and there were many scores more than that suffered the same outcome, were sunk at sea by storms. They were ill-prepared to negotiate the proverb of the ancient world: cling closely to the coast and never sail in the winter. Cling closely to the coast, we're going to see that, and never sail in the winter. We're going to see that too, and what happened. The same thing that happened to Rome's first military navy 100 ships went down at sea because of storms, because the Romans were uninitiated in the storm seasons of the Mediterranean Sea. So they just boldly as they were and ambitiously as they were and warlike as they were, said the Carthaginians have ships, we'll just build them and beat them with our ships. They never engaged in battle. They were lost at sea. And that stuck in the Roman mind. So Theophilus, to whom this historical narrative is being written, would have already been well aware culturally of the significance of the sea airports, the commercial travel on which passengers could find a place on the deck, and also the large literary heritage of Homer's Odyssey. So this is, if you will, what a first century reader in the Greco-Roman world might expect to find: a thrilling rendition of sea voyage and shipwreck at sea. It was part of their culture every day. So we have to know that. We also have to recognize that in the seventh decade of the first century BC, Rome had commissioned Pompey, who eventually became Pompey the Great, another example of our modest Greeks and Romans that we've talked about. But Pompey the Great was commissioned by the Senate and by the Roman Republic to rid the seas of pirates. He was given limitless resources in 3 years. He did it in 3 months and was hailed as Pompey the Great. Why? Because pirates had proliferated to the point that the airports and seaports and commercial travel had been stymied by the outbreak of large numbers of sea pirates. So this again contributed to the culture. And lastly, we might say that the polytheism and the religious worship of the gods accompanied every voyage. There were sacrifices made, prayers made to the gods for safe passage. 2 statistics to tell you why. They're from historians rather than biblical teachers. 2 statistics. One is that because of weather, 50%, it is estimated, of all flights or seaboard travel were delayed because of bad weather. Now, you've sat on an airport strip before and waited, looked at your watch and waited. Probably prudently you've said there must be a good reason, so I should wait patiently. But in the ancient world, 50% of all commercial travel by sea was delayed because of weather. And 20% of the voyages taken encountered threatening storms. If those historical statistics are accurate, that means that individuals that frequently traveled by sea, across the Aegean and in the Mediterranean, that 1 out of every 5 vessels, every plane that takes off from the airport by analogy, 1 out of 5 encountered danger from a storm. So we're trying to acquire in 10 minutes the mentality of the first century audience to whom Luke is giving a spellbinding rendition of precisely the things that they encountered in their own culture on a daily basis. Now, we go to verse 1 and we can make some headway. We've got some basic equipment of historical and cultural background to enable us to hopefully kind of grasp here what Luke is saying. I think it does escape most English readers. In verse 1, we learn that Festus, in coordination with his cabinet, his concilium, he has made the decision now to expedite Paul's travel to Rome. He puts Paul in the care and in the custody of Julius. Quite a name. And it may reflect what Claudius, the previous emperor's name, reflected. Perhaps Julius reflects Julius Caesar and the fact that his ancestor became a citizen of Rome under the princeps and under the imperial rule, nearly. The empire had not quite been birthed under Octavius at that point. But what we do know is that Julius is more than likely reflects that his ancestry was freed from slavery by Julius Caesar. The Augustan cohort refers to the imperial auxiliary troops that were stationed in the province of Syria. Apparently, there were 6 cohorts in Syria. A cohort was of auxiliary or local troops, usually taken from somewhere in Phoenicia or in Greece or in Syria, in fact. So Julius is introduced to us, but what you and I already know, because we've studied Luke and most of Acts, is that Luke portrays centurions as benevolent individuals who aid in the providence of God, who aid Christianity, even as the centurion looks at the cross and says, truly this man was the Son of God. So if we're alert, we see that another centurion is coming along, and he's going to act just like Luke's other centurions. He is going to be a benefactor to Paul. And this is the providence of God. And we are reminded that in life, it is not just Christians whom God controls and uses. That God may use other people, even unconverted people, to guide, to help, and to be a part of the providence that he executes from now until the end of human history. So this centurion is going to be an important character this morning because of his benevolent attitude towards Paul. He respects Paul. Paul is an educated, knowledgeable Roman citizen who has never been charged with a crime. He's had 2 hearings, but he has not been charged with a crime. And for whatever reason, Julius seems to have been aware of Paul's high standing and treats him even with deference. So that's what we're told. We're also told that other prisoners were in the custody of Julius and a number of other soldiers. A centurion had anywhere from 60 to 100 troops, soldiers, under his care, but in this case, perhaps 10 or 12 soldiers did accompany Julius because of the prisoners. And remember, most prisoners that were being transported to Rome were not happy campers. They ordinarily, it would seem from history, were individuals who were being sent to Rome for a particular prosecution. And they know that they may end up in one of several places. We know that commercial vessels often brought individual criminals from around the empire to war in the gladiatorial games, or to engage in battle with a wild animal. So that does take place. We're not told that specifically here, but what we want to remember is that while Paul has a vision to go to Rome and wishes to go to Rome, these other individuals are not so inclined. That's why later, when the ship wrecks, the soldiers are going to kill the prisoners rather than let them escape. And because Paul is on board, the centurion, this Julius, spares their lives. Sometimes having a Christian next door can be a great help. Now, the individual, Julius, has his entourage of soldiers. He is in charge, and he has this group of prisoners, probably disinclined to take any kind of voyage toward Rome. And here we're told, again, the Augustan cohort is an imperial cohort, a cohort being between 600 and 1,000 men. There appear to have been 6 cohorts in Syria, but the only legionaries are in Antioch. There are no legions in the province, an area of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Only auxiliary troops were placed there. And it's a good thing they were there as far as Rome's interests were concerned. Well, it tells us in verse 2 something that unfortunately, I want you to know I did search, perhaps high and low. You know that when we talk about geography and places where Paul has been, that we've included a map in the bulletin. And there's one in the bulletin this morning that will be convince us all of the adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. You see the arrow there, but I'll talk about why what happens. Unfortunately, in looking for maps, this appeared to be the best one because of its insert of of Crete, but it lacks the identification of Adramyttian. But for those of you who remember our previous maps, Adramyttian is just below Troy, Assos, and other Western Asian ports. Now, this is very important in the study of ancient sea travel. This ship is what it was called a coasting ship, a coasting vessel, just like we call small planes commuter planes. They had commuter ships. There are three things about these ships that we need to know to understand what Luke is saying. Verse 1 tells us this indicates for the first time since chapter 21 that Luke is included with Paul and Aristarchus on this trip. So this is what we call a part of the we narrative. Luke is here, and you have an eyewitness account of this miraculous, real-life sea romance, the high seas and the adventure that captivated the imagination of Greeks and Romans in the ancient world, from Homer's Odyssey right down to novels of the first century. So, a coasting vessel has three things. First, it's smaller and not seaworthy to do passage on the open sea. The Mediterranean is a broad sea. It's quite large. We're used to talking about simply the coast of Judea, but the ancient world revolved in most instances, other than the ancient civilizations of the Tigris and Euphrates. Other than that, ancient civilizations were birthed and grew up in the Mediterranean world, in the Mediterranean Sea. So a coasting vessel was a smaller ship that delivered, not primarily passengers, there were no passenger ships, but delivered goods along the coast of Asia Minor, taking things from places such as Caesarea, where this ship is docked, taking goods from the east, as caravans would bring goods from the Far East to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. They would put them oftentimes on these myriad numbers. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these ships that they were smaller and not seaworthy for the open sea. Secondly, they made progress in two ways: by the coastal currents. And some of you that have grown up on the coast know that oftentimes the currents near the coast or coastal currents run contrary to the direction of the winds. So a coastal vessel could, as the name implies, travel near the coast and make use of coastal currents, and number two, of land breezes that were often more gentle and directionally favorable, rather than the general direction of the wind in the dangerous season in the ancient world. All scholars of this particular topic agree that the northwestern winds prevailed now just as they did then. So a coasting vessel, smaller, it uses the coastal currents, it uses land breezes, and it's place of travel is along the ports of coast, delivering goods oftentimes from the Tigris-Euphrates area. Valuable minerals, very many other things were placed on these coasting vessels, and ladies and gentlemen, an individual could make, we'll find this out in a minute, this will enter into a decision, individuals could make a small fortune by owning a fleet or several coasting vessels, and if they can avoid the 20%, 1 in 5 storms that ships encountered, they could make a handsome living, and many individuals in the ancient world from Egypt and Syria and Rome itself signed on these ships because of the wealth that was produced in bringing goods from port to port. And on your map, you can see where the ship began in Caesarea, all the way to in the right bottom corner, and making its way along the southern coast of Asia Minor. And we'll talk about Lycia and Pamphylia only in a sentence or two. We're told here to sail to the regions, it says, and embarking on an Adramyttian ship. So the home port of this ship is Adramyttia. What has the ship done? It's gone southward down the Asia Minor coast, all the way over to the what we call the Holy Land, all the way over to the Phoenician coast where Tyre and Sidon. It's traded. Now it's going to pick up goods and retrace its steps back to its home port in Adramyttia. So Julius says, hey, this is great. I'll just put my prisoners, as he had anticipated, on the ship, and we'll make our way back across the lee of Cyprus, all the way on the coast of Asia Minor, and we'll return safely to Adramyttia, load up again, and make the trip again. And we may gain a fair fortune in doing this. Julius had authority, and Julius, some have said, has commandeered this ship. I think that is historically unlikely. He need not commandeer the ship. The ship is headed along the southern coast of Asia Minor, where he's going. He's going to Myra, and there's a reason for that. But anyway, let's just speed up a little bit and discuss the route of the voyage and why they do what they do. And I really think it would be helpful. The intent in including the map was for your benefit, and so to look at it, I think, might be an appropriate way to gain from what Luke says. Details are somewhat cumbersome to modern readers. They don't want to fool with it. They just want the answer. They don't want to make the effort to figure out how they got the answer. They just want the answer. And as soon as they get the answer, they go on, and they don't really learn a lot that way, and you teachers know that. So, but the ancient world was interested, and remember Theophilus and his readers, to them these were common flights. If someone tells you I'm flying to Atlanta and Denver, that's common knowledge to you. You know where those places are, or you're flying directly from Charlotte to Seattle, or you're flying to a particular airport, LaGuardia in New York. So these places that are strange to us were very familiar to the ancient readers and Theophilus, and Luke includes them because he is actually an eyewitness. He is present on the ship at Adramyttia. As it leaves Caesarea, we're told that, and the reason for this, I'm not sure anyone knows precisely and irrefutably why, but Luke mentions the fact that the we included a regular traveler with Paul in his missionary journeys. We met him in chapter 19 in Ephesus. He is called Aristarchus, and he's from Thessalonica in Macedonia. It may be that Luke is telling us that Aristarchus, having been with Paul through his imprisonment, is now taking the Adramyttian ship back toward his home, and that he is leaving to go home. And so he accompanies Paul as he regularly did. On the other hand, he's mentioned in Colossians, and it may be that he makes his way with Paul all the way to Rome. But anyway, that is there is no perfect explanation for why Aristarchus travels, but it would appear we're reduced to two alternatives. That is, he's heading back to Thessalonica, or he's determined to continue his companionship with Paul all the way to Rome. Please remember, as we've tried to point out throughout this book of Acts, that Paul rarely traveled alone. He had a missionary team, he had associates, whether Silas or Gaius or Barnabas or Aristarchus or any of the people that we've mentioned going along the way. Paul often traveled with companions, just like you and I ought to. And I'm not taking a page from the book of allegory. I'm just saying that as we make our voyage, as we'll see in a moment, having associates and friends was helpful to Paul and is needful and helpful for you and for me. Now, the quick leg of the voyage leaves, as we're told here, leaves from Caesarea and goes to Sidon. Tyre and Sidon are competitive twin cities. We talked about Tyre and Alexander the Great building the causeway. I'm calling it a causeway. That's not the exact term. Out to Tyre when he besieged it and captured it. Well, Sidon was a rival sister city, an ancient Phoenician port. And what we read is that in his travels, the captain of the ship keeps Cyprus on what is called the leeward side. And what leeward means, and the only reason I'm introducing that word is that in the English Standard Version and in the NIV, it uses leeward. But for us landlubbers, maybe even landlubbers, but for us, for most of us, the leeward is perhaps unfamiliar, and it means the sheltered side of the ship. So if the winds are coming from the west, then an island on our port side will keep the winds from pushing the vessel out to sea or up against the coastline. So because this is very late, we'll see in a moment, it's identified with the fast of Yom Kippur, and Luke will mention that in a moment, that it's late in the travel season. It's in a risky period, and so the pilot decides to keep on the leeward side of Cyprus. Remember, Paul went there in his first missionary journey. He keeps the island of Cyprus on uses that on the leeward side of the island to keep his ship from being driven back up against the coast. He makes his way to Sidon, and this is why I've mentioned Aristarchus' associates. It says that Julius, there was a reason I elaborated a little bit on the centurion once again. It says here that from there, Julius treated Paul, verse 3, Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. There are some erudite interpreters of early Christianity who believe that this word friends, I'm not endorsing the interpretation, it seems certainly possible, maybe even probable. I'm not prepared to make an absolute statement about it. But the word philos, y'all are aware of the three words for love in the language of the New Testament: eros, agape, and philos. This is philos and refers to one who is loved or befriended. It's not the intensity and does not involve necessarily the sacrifice of agape, but it is at times used interchangeably in the Gospel of John, for example. So, what we have here is apparently a statement in which Christians are identified actually and literally as friends. That Paul, who does not appear to have ever been in Sidon, been near Tyre, had not been in Sidon as far as we know, that he went ashore and Christian friends took care of him. Some suggest he may have had a mild malady and needed medical care, but he had Luke as his personal physician. This seems unlikely to me. It's not stated in the text, and it's conjecture. But what we do see here is that the Christians are friends. A brief commercial for you. We are brothers and sisters. That is a relationship established by God the Holy Spirit in the electing grace of the Father. We're brothers and sisters in Christ, just like you have perhaps a sibling who's a brother or a sister according to the flesh. What I think is helpful is if we make the effort to make sure that we're not only brothers and sisters, but we're friends. And that means that we need to take the time and make the effort to listen to our brothers and sisters about their life, about what interests them, about their concerns, and with sincerity, as the New Testament says, that love is to be without hypocrisy, but sincere, in sincerity, to make sure that these are not just technical brothers and sisters, but these are friends. And I'm aware, as you are, that everyone doesn't share the same interests, and some friendships come naturally, some you have to work at. But what I am suggesting here is that these Sidonians in the city of Sidon didn't know Paul. They knew of Paul and who Paul was, but they weren't personally his friends, and nevertheless, because of Christ, they befriend him and take care of his needs. I think it's probable that one of the needs was to make sure they had ample food for the voyage. Because food, it was not a passenger ship. Oh, listen, some of you who have taken cruises have told me about the buffets on these ships. I've almost wanted to pinch pennies and go just for that. But there was nothing provided in the prisons or on the ships. So an individual befriended Paul probably indicates that the supplies they needed to complete the voyage on the coasting vessel headed for Adramyttian, probably they needed supplies. And perhaps as the winter season was approaching, perhaps additional clothing, an outer cape or something. Our commercial simply is that we're not just brothers and sisters, we ought to cultivate friendships, hospitality, those things that make us willing brothers and sisters, so that when they have needs, we as their friends, like the Sidonians, can help them and befriend them. Now, it tells us in verse 4 what we've already said. When we put out to sea, we sailed under the shelter, that's leeward under the lee of Cyprus in other versions. New American Standard has under the shelter of, and that's simply synonymous with lee, the leeward side. So, but now it says, when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. I want you to look at where this vessel is going. On the right-hand side, you see Sidon. That is a one-day journey. It's 69 nautical miles from Caesarea to Sidon. They make it in one day. The winds are favorable. Then they leave and go to Cilicia, and you see Pamphylia. Paul was from Cilicia, Tarsus in Cilicia. Cilicia is not listed on the map. Pamphylia is. This is where they landed, John Mark and Barnabas, on their first missionary voyage long, long ago. In the book of Acts, we studied that. But I've got to tell you about Myra. And without this, I just don't know how you can go on with your interpretation. I just don't know how you can do that. Myra was what was called an Alexandrian grain port. And the reason, if you will look and take a plumb line, imagine having a plumb line, drop it from Myra to Alexandria. You have a straight line. And when you know what you're about to hear, you'll see why Myra was so important. 1/3 of the grain consumed in Rome, the population of which in the first century was nearly 1 million people. The amount of grain that Rome consumed in a calendar year 1/3 of that came from Alexandria, from Egypt. And you do know the reason without me telling you, that the Nile flows there. So Egypt provided much of the first century world with their grain. And Roman grain ships were under the surveillance and oversight of the Roman government, because dole grain was given to many in the city of Rome. So there was a hint of, well, more than a hint. There was a statism, if you will, in allocating grain to the citizens of Rome. And 1/3 of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons of grain that was consumed in Rome, 1/3 of it came transported on Alexandrian grain ships. And when they made their trip to Rome, they sailed straight across to the Asia Minor coast and embarked off of the ship and took on perhaps passengers, as they will do now, and made their way from Myra across the Mediterranean, Aegean and Mediterranean, to the Adriatic Sea and to Rome. Actually, they went around Sicily and up, as you see. But the point is that Myra's location was a strategic necessity for navigating, particularly as the winter season came on, of getting those ships across the Mediterranean. And they were, listen, when there was no grain in Rome, there were riots in the streets. I think all of us have heard the term bread and circuses. I think that comes, it's actually quite accurate. What people call the hoi polloi, the run-of-the-mill individual who lived in Rome, maybe was unemployed, maybe a street person, maybe an individual who had worked hard and not been able to provide. The state did provide an allocation of grain to the Roman citizenry in the days of Paul. And they also, emperors were also popular when they put on circuses, which often involved gladiatorial combat. They actually floated the Colosseum, put water in the Colosseum and had sea battles. And then they would have man versus wild animal fights. You may have seen the picture of the individual with a spear and a net and a leopard there, or a lion. And actually, I'm afar. I've got a ways to go, but I'm going to say it. The pictures we see of Christians and the lions, often you see the fact that Christians who were put in with the lions, which they were on occasion, this was not a daily thing, but on occasion they were put into the Colosseum. Lions were released. Christians refused to fight. So they were kind of dullards as far as the crowd was concerned, number one. Number two, they became unpopular with many, but there were others who admired their courage. They would gather in circles and pray for the people who were persecuting them. And the lions would come, and usually it was fatal for them. But the crowd was not pleased with the efforts that the Christians made, many of them. And I'm sure there were different things that took place. I'm sure many of them, maybe some of them did. The point is, we're back to the prisoners that were with Julius and Paul. These people were not enthusiastic about this trip because it probably was going to end in a sentence passed on them, unless they were acquitted, a sentence passed on them that could involve them in a deadly practice that was entertainment, bread and circuses. And I'm telling you this, ladies and gentlemen, today America has become like that. Show me the circus. Tap. Watch the brutal combat that is on the networks today, and the violence and the brutality and the sense of the loss of human life and of any sense of sanctity or decorum or the importance of human life. We're becoming like that. Give me enough to eat, give me entertainment, and I'm happy. So the bread and the circuses was a problem. And that's eventually why Rome, I got to get back to the text. That's eventually why Rome had so many mercenaries. So Rome declined largely in part, and this grain dole was critically. In fact, Claudius gave an incentive, and that brings us back to the text. Why is the captain and the owner of the ship so determined to put out to sea when it is dangerous? The incentive of late in the season, we know it because it was after Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, because grain shipments that came into Rome late in the sailing season, they didn't sail or were not supposed to sail after the middle of November. And shipping ceased until the middle of March and sometimes later. But a ship that came majestically to the Roman ports, not Rome, but their ports, they paid a premium for that grain. So when this, in just a moment, when the ship owner and the pilot are talking about whether or not to sail on, it's not an unbiased opinion that they give. They hope that they can get there late in the sailing season. Their grain will be more expensive and bring a greater profit. This is nothing but what we have today in the stock market and futures. There's a futures in Roman grain. And so this is what is impelling the owner and the pilot to go against the commonsensical advice given to them by the mature Paul. We're almost to that point, but let's finish the trip and understand what happens on the map. Verse 6, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. There's your grain ship. It's bigger and has more tonnage capacity to haul these large grain shipments. Why do we know that? We know that because later in chapter 27, they are going to jettison the cargo, and they are going to jettison the wheat into the sea. We have a positive identification from Luke himself that this was an Alexandrian grain ship. And we have from Luke himself what we already would know about it because they're docking at Myra. And Myra is the direct port to the north that would eventually be the port of disembarkation to go to Rome. Myra was an Alexandrian grain. Many, many scores of ships went there. Many wintered there. But greed affects us, and it's going to affect the outcome of this story. But what Julius does is said, oh, good, y'all are going to Rome with that Roman grain shipment. We'll just get on board with you. So they get on an Alexandrian grain ship in Myra, and then we're told, and I don't think we need to go into extraordinary detail here. He simply says, when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived at Cnidus. You see where that is. He's moving in a westwardly direction from Myra. It's about 170 miles. But Luke is warning us of what is going to come. He emphasizes twice in this passage the difficulty and the contrary winds that are keeping them from the progress they had hoped to make. But they finally make it to Cnidus, but Luke tells us here, at least the New American Standard translates verse 7, with difficulty. And so the wind did not permit us to go farther. They couldn't go farther west. So what they did was, the NIV will say, we sailed under this lee of Crete off Salmone. And you see it there on your map, Crete, and the insert gives you a picture. Why did they do that? Well, they dropped down so that they could use Crete as a barrier against what? Against the northern winds that late in the sailing season increased in intensity, and the barometer changed and things changed. And remember, Paul is not a meteorologist, and neither were they. They didn't have hurricane hunters and some of the detecting devices that modern technology has. So meteorology was not and even today, I think we agree, is the weather will tell you it's not a natural science, it's not perfect, but they were not advanced in meteorology. They probably had adages just like you and I have. Red sky at night, navigator's delight. red sky in the morning, navigator's warning. So they had the signs and the seasons. They had approximate dates for when it was safe to sail. And the prudent took note of those notes of advice that experience birthed. Well, the wind didn't help them, so they dropped down and used Crete. But when they get to Fairhaven, they have to put in. Once again, it says this in verse 8. Since the wind did not permit us to go further west, in other words, from Cnidus west, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fairhaven, which was near the city of Lasea. And you see it there on the insert on the right hand of the map that is included in your bulletin this morning. See how they come down and they use the eastern coast of Crete, and they use the southern coast of Crete as a buffer from the wind. Perhaps coastal currents helped, perhaps a land breeze helped, but they made their way to Fairhaven, and they were thankful to do that. And here we come. It may surprise you, for the first time we hear about Paul. It's all the way in verse 10 before Paul makes a comment. What is Luke doing? Well, he's telling us the enthralling, mesmerizing story that in the culture went back to Homer's Odyssey. It was a part of novels that were written. And just like people like Space Trilogy and Star Wars, these people liked the high adventure and the myths of Homer and the Odyssey and the siren calling out and the maelstrom that pulls the ship down into the sea like jaws of death closing on the horrified sailors. So you and I may not be interested in leeward and meteorology and all those things, but his audience was, and he's telling them a story because he wants to tell them something about God. And that's important. It doesn't hurt you to be interested in something that another person has an interest in, to show an interest in that so that you can tell them about God. And Paul is going to tell them. Well, what happened at Fairhaven? I am going to have a comment or two on this. Fairhaven, the text even tells us that the port of Fairhaven was not a desirable port. The reason for that is it covered only 50% of the compass. That means that 50% of the compass was exposed to variable winds. And in the winter, as they're going to find out, and we'll find out next week, the wind shifted. And the winds drove them out to sea and would have brought them to a watery grave had it not been for the providence of God. Because some men wanted profit more than safety. And people still do that. And some pay for it in the same way. They don't have Paul on board and they go down, lost at sea. Anyway, when considerable time had passed, verse 9, and the voyage was now dangerous since even the fast was already over. We are nearly certain that this is AD 59, and we're not going to calculate that again. We've done that in the past. This appears to be October of AD 59 because the fast, or the feast, actually, some have called it, but the fast for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, in AD 59, we know was October 5th. And this was well beyond October 5th. November marked the change from the designated risky, the season in which they're already traveling, and the season dangerous, not suitable for travel. So they are just on the nub of coming in the dangerous and not suitable for travel time of the year. And so they have a meeting of the individuals who are in charge. And it says at the end of verse 9, Paul, his actual quotation of words begin in verse 10. We haven't even talked about Paul. We've talked about the nautical implications of what Luke is wanting us to understand. He says, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage, great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Now, some critical interpreters say this never happened because the captain and the owner would not have solicited Paul's advice. But I'm just going to ask you to jot down or to go with me to 2 Corinthians. This will take 30 seconds. To go with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. And it tells us something strikingly important to this passage and to this council. It says there in an autobiographical section, in the context, Paul is arguing that he is an apostle and saying, I may be acting foolishly, but I'm going to give you an example of all the sufferings I've been through as an apostle. These Johnny-come-latelys that have come into Corinth don't know a thing about Christ, don't know a thing about suffering as an apostle, and I'm going to tell you about my sufferings, even though I shouldn't probably indulge it. I'm going to do it anyway. And so he does in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians. It's a pretty well-known chapter. But probably we go through the chapter without thinking about Acts 27. It says there, I was shipwrecked 3 times. In other words, this ocean voyage, could I use a colloquial expression? This was not Paul's first rodeo. Paul, we wouldn't know it. We wouldn't know it except that he randomly mentions it in another letter that was written before this. 2 Corinthians was written, we think, about AD 55. So this is written 4 years before he's on this ship. But he basically once included in the discussion said, hey fellas, I've been on this kind of a deal before, and 3 times I've been shipwrecked. That's quite a startling number. Remember, 20% encountered storms. Paul had been in on that 20%. Shipwrecked 3 times, and then he goes on to say later in that verse, he goes on to say, I spent a day and night in the deep. That would terrify me. I think of any fate that I could have to be put out in the ocean at night by myself. That would be, I would not do well with that. But Paul says a night and day, in other words, in one of the shipwrecks, or perhaps another one, he was bobbing like a cork in the Mediterranean. So, as I said, this isn't Paul's first rodeo. He's coming to these men probably because he has gone to Julius, the centurion, and said, look, fellas, he's an older man. He is highly experienced in sea travel. Just across the Aegean, he's traveled many, many score times. And he's been shipwrecked 3 times, and he spent a night and day in the deep. And he's telling them, fellas, look, this is going to be hazardous to that cargo that you're trying to sell, but also to our own lives, including mine. He hasn't had the vision from the angel yet. That comes later next week. Brothers and sisters, God gives us in life friends, brothers and sisters, but he also gives to us people who have some wisdom. This is not evidencing that Paul was a polymath. A polymath is an individual with encyclopedic knowledge of all areas. Paul is not a polymath. He's not necessarily an expert in nautical affairs, but he has experience in sea travel. He is a godly man, which doesn't mean he's smarter than they in nautical matters. But it does indicate that he is a man of mature experiential wisdom, and that his experience has been, look, out of the times I've been sailing, I've already been shipwrecked 3 times. But there are 2 parties that make the difference. The ship owner, it tells us, we're almost finished. It says here, but the centurion, verse 11, was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship. Why? That owner, that pilot or owner, that pilot is actually the word for indicating not only the pilot, the man in charge. That probably is not a word that is communicative very well in the New American Standard. The idea is the owner and the captain. So the individual who is the captain as far as nautical knowledge and seamanship, he may have been an Egyptian himself from, they were prized, the Egyptians from Alexandria were prized because they were used to the Nile and the winter storms that buffeted the Egyptian coast. So this man may have been an Egyptian. That's just conjecture. But what's translated pilot here is the owner. And what they're seeing is they're taking their glasses off and they're looking at a profit margin sheet. And they're saying, if we can make this trip, we're going to hit the jackpot. It's after the feast. It's late October. Ships stop in November. So if we can pull this off, if we can pull this off, we're going to make a killing. And they were right. They almost did make a killing, not the kind they thought. More persuaded by the pilot. Listen, in life, two things. If you have a mature mentor, you're blessed. A wise, godly individual with experience. It's not necessarily the number of degrees, because that captain probably had postgraduate training in seamanship. But they are informed by the profit motive, apparently. And number two, well, I have to tell you, the sailors. And the sailors themselves are known for preferring bars and bordellos than spending the winter in Fairhaven, which was a sleepy fishing village. Phoenix, 60 miles away, only a day voyage with promising winds. But a day's voyage away is Phoenix, a big city. And some of you have been in the Navy, and you know that sailors on leave, they want an active nightlife. Maybe that's a safer way to say it. They don't want to be sitting in a sleepy fishing village like McClellanville, South Carolina, where there's not even a sit-go. They want to be in a big city with the lights, the ladies, and the alcoholic beverages. And so the sailors are saying, look, I don't want to spend the all winters three or 4 months. I don't want to spend it in McClellanville. There's nothing there. No skirts, no sauce. I don't want to be there. And so between the sailors and the owner of the ship is counting his and saying, okay, let's make for it. Don't you do that in your life? Don't you do that in your life? You listen to wise, mature, godly people who can keep you from going out to sea where a nor'easter awaits. And the reason I mentioned verse 13 is these optimistic individuals wake up the next morning and there's a gentle southern breeze. We're going to make it. They pull anchor and they get a little ways out toward Phoenix, and a dramatic nor'easter hits them, and they won't see the sun for 2 weeks. Don't you do that in your life? Find, if you are able, in receiving counsel and guidance, which all of us need, mature, experienced, godly people. And when they give you advice, you listen to that advice, not the profit motive, not the convenient motive, and God forbid, certainly not the entertainment motive. And not the circuses and the bread, and selling the bread at a high price. But calm, dignified integrity, sophistication in the Word of God, experience in life with the irregularities and eccentricities of people, get your advice there. And when you get it, don't you kick against the goads, as Euripides started and even Jesus quoted. So this is where we conclude. And I just want you to see those sailors waking up the next morning and the breeze, even a moderate, not the gale, a moderate south wind came up. Supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor. And so did some of you. And it wasn't a pretty voyage. And it wasn't a pretty outcome. You keep that anchor down until you know what God wants you to do. And when you have had confirmation by wise, godly, learned, experienced people, then with prayer and caution, you proceed, not allegorically, but practically and experientially as a child of God. Well, let's pray. Father, we thank you for Luke's abilities, actually, to place into interesting expressions this particular episode in the life of Paul. And while not deeply theological or doctrinal, nevertheless an important lesson in life for us. And we want to glean from that. Would you give us, and I believe that you have, in some instances, given to us mature and experienced godly people, and particularly for the young, that they would take the advice of parents and grandparents about the vicissitudes of life and the difficulties of life. It may appear to be a soft southern breeze, but in the next mile there is a deadly northeaster. So help us, we pray. Give us humility. Give us caution. Give us prudence. Help us to be friends to those around us, not only simply brothers and sisters and siblings of faith, but ones who show an interest in and are willing to help others in our assembly and beyond who need our support and assistance. Thank you for these things in the name of Christ. Amen.